I am so excited to be on Ordinary People, Extraordinary Things today with Todd. Thank you so much for being on.
I'm excited.
Yeah, and this is our first video, so totally exciting.
This is your first video
Yeah, I've only done audio.
on 34 podcasts.
Yes.
This is the first one with
I know.
video. That's very cool.
I know.
Yeah. People are going to walk up to you in public and say, "You're a celebrity."
Hey, I know you. Hey, aren't you that person?
That's right. That's right.
So thanks for agreeing to be on. I mostly just ask everybody 3 things or words, phrases that describe you.
3 things that describe me. I would say, as far as what I do work-wise, I would say servant leader. I would say loyal. And then probably, and it's weird to say this, but I would say humble, but it's when somebody asks you, you normally don't go, everybody would say I'm humble. But I would say probably those 3 words, yeah.
And can you explain what servant leader means?
So I lead here, have the blessing and the good fortune to serve here at Canvas, and we have probably close to 750 what we call Canvas family members, so employees.
Yeah.
And you know, it's interesting as the CEO. You know, oftentimes people will have this perception of a CEO, and you get, you know, it's all the cool stuff, and you know, you get to sit in an office by yourself, and
Right.
people do things for you, and it's yeah, you could actually approach the position that way,
Right.
but you know, the way I've always approached it is, you know, I'm very blessed to get the opportunity to lead people and most importantly to serve them. And so as a leader, I think that it's incredibly important that you always approach how you lead through service.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you for explaining that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my husband, Chris, he actually works here. He said, you have to have Todd on your podcast. And being the CEO, I was like, yeah, he probably will say no. But you made time for it, so thank you so much.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure.
And so one of the things that I wanted to ask you is that Canvas is a huge company, and how do you show your Christian faith in a secular world?
You know, I think it's through, funny enough, going back to what we said before, I think it's through how you serve people. I think that, you know, it's interesting. I've been in the credit union industry for coming up on 30 years in May.
Okay.
And I've been in leadership positions throughout my career, but when I came here 7.5 years ago to Canvas, it was my first opportunity to be the CEO. And I remember I talked to our board, and when they were interviewing me, and they were, you know, they want to know what experience you have, and tell us what you know about lending, tell us what you know. And oftentimes they're asking these questions, as you can tell, that they don't even know how to answer that, but they need to ask these questions, and you know, what do you think about our balance sheet, and what do you think about the opportunities for growth, et cetera? You know, what would your plan be, et cetera? Those are the things they have to ask, but I think it was interesting at the point when they say, hey, when they said, you know, tell us about, you know, something about you and the way you're going to approach this that maybe we haven't asked. And I'm like, you know, I was waiting to see if you would ask that, and I said, I need you to know that I've had the opportunity, I've been blessed for a lot of years to lead in different capacities and lead a lot of people. But, you know, I had just turned 50 years old, and I said, I've had some great successes, and I have screwed up royally over the years and have made a lot of mistakes. And what I've learned now at this stage of the game, if I'm blessed with the opportunity to lead this organization, then you're going to hear me use words that are going to be super foreign to you. You're going to hear me talk about love and grace and family and heart. You know, it's going to be about serving others and not about self. And I said, so you're going to hear words and phrases, and you're going to hear, most importantly, concepts coming from me that I will be injecting into this company. And then over time, we're going to build this culture that's going to be about that love and family and heart and trust and transparency and grace and you'll fully understand what that means. And so for me, I didn't have to sit and say to them, oh, by the way, hey, just want to let you guys know I'm a believer, you know, in case you're interested.
Right.
But the interesting thing is when I had that conversation and I shared that with them, invariably, you know, a couple of the folks offline, after they hired me, they're like, so are you a believer? You know, it's like, yeah.
Yeah.
They're like, I could tell, you know,
Yeah.
and I think the point is I think that you don't have to sit and you know, say all the things and wear it on your sleeve. I think that how you treat people, people will say, hey, why do you talk about grace, Todd? You know, for instance,
Right.
what does that mean? And then you get the opportunity to share that with them, and invariably people begin to connect the dots, right? And I think my I guess, you know, my belief has always been that if you do that and you do that regularly and you do it day after day after day and you're really consistent in terms of how you treat people, what ends up happening is some point somebody will say, hey, can you tell me, they'll say,
Right.
can you tell me more about that? Because you said something the other day, and I remember hearing that in church one time or something like
Right.
that, right?
Right.
I don't think, and I think that you have the opportunity to win people over by being that way rather than sort of pushing it into people's faces, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. And I think the world we live in right now, it doesn't want to be pushed on, right? Like, we're kind of seeing a shift, I feel like, in that. But people still invariably want the things that Jesus tells us to be: kind, loving, gracious, faithful, you know, patient, you know, all these things. So if we can show the world that, then we're actually showing our faith without having to say, hey,
Right.
do you know this? Do you know this? But like you said, if we can show that love, then people are drawn to that, just because that's how we're made,
Yeah.
I feel like, is to be drawn to those kind of attributes that
I agree.
that are maybe not so
Sexy.
they're hard to find in this world a
Right,
little bit,
right.
right? Like, it's hard to be a servant leader. Like, it's easier to say, like, well, why don't you serve me? You know, and not just in your position, just in general. So,
No, I agree.
yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So you've been a leader for a long time. When you were growing up or kind of just starting, did you always kind of see yourself as a leader of a big company, or what?
No,
Okay.
no, you know, it's interesting if my parents are still living and you know, they tell stories to my kids and they tell the same stories over and over again. But it's interesting looking back. If you hear my dad talk in particular, he'll tell stories of when I was younger and you know, how I interacted all the way back in elementary school and then middle school and high school and when I played sports and all those things. And it was always this. He always talked about. You know, how he would say the Pied Piper, kind of like the leader of the pack. I don't think I ever approached it that way. I think it was just I had a very strong personality. Even when I was young, I remember I was very convicted about, you know, just about anything and everything.
Yeah.
And if we were just playing a game of baseball out in the backyard, I was all in. And then. As I got older in middle school and then high school and then on in college, I always gravitated towards leadership positions as chosen by the group that I was with. It was never like, I'm running for class president.
Yeah.
You know, it would just be like, hey, we think you should be this, and people would support me in that regard. And I never sought it, and I never really, it's funny, I never really cared too much about it. I was like, yeah, sure, I'll lead the group, sure. And then when I in college, through college, and then when I got out of college, I actually had another career, and I was a singer and an entertainer, traveled and things like that. And then Nanita and I had our first child, our oldest son, who just turned 30, and I had to get a job. I'd been traveling around the world doing shows, but I needed insurance. That's what I should say. And I started working for a credit union, in Miami, and I just thought it was a temporary job, and I'm now almost 30 years. But interestingly, that was where I guess my personality and how I would lead when I would get into a group dynamic surfaced, and there was an old CEO that sort of saw that in me and began to make investments in me. And it's funny, so I never, to answer your question, I never sat and thought, I'm going to be a CEO one day. In fact, for probably the first, Nancy, 5 years of my time in credit unions, I still was like, this is still a temporary kind of gig for me. I'm going to, I had my degree in advertising. I'm going to go do something else, right? And it was at the point when the credit union I was working for in Atlanta, they made me the number 2 person at the organization, when I thought, maybe I could be a CEO. The interesting thing, though, and this is really a faith kind of thing. I was so, at that point, I'm like, I could do this. And I remember for a number of years, I was focused on, I'm going to be the CEO. I'm smarter than the old guy. I used to always say, I'm smarter than him. I run faster and jump higher. He needs to retire and get out of here. And I think it was at that point where I feel like, the Lord was teaching me a lesson, and it was a lesson in humility. And I was ready, but I had this really bad tension with the CEO for a couple of years. And I remember talking to my dad for 2 years, and my dad, I'm like, I don't understand it, man. He and I used to get along really well, and and I'm the guy, and I said, well, Dad, what do you think I should do? And he's like, I'm glad you asked, and he begins to lay out this advice for me, but what he basically said was, son, you have no humility right now. You're so full of yourself. You're so cocky and arrogant about how smart you are and how you're leading the organization. Funny enough, he gave me part of his advice. He said some things I can't say here. He was very,
strong with
my
his
dad
words.
is not a cussing man, and he didn't do that, but he was like very, very direct with me. But one of the things he said was, it was awesome. He said, do you feel like you're serving, this is my dad, do you feel like you're serving, Rick was the CEO, Rick. I know you're unhappy, but are you serving him too? But I sure am. He goes, I don't think you are. I don't think you are. He says, I think you need to humble yourself, son, and I think you need to go and you need to talk with him. And I think that you need to get, to the bottom of what this issue is that seems to be taking place. Yeah. And I went and I went and I talked to him, and sure enough, he said, hey, because I said, what's the problem been? What's the issue, man? I feel like we haven't been in sync. He says, well, I'm glad you asked. Sort of like my dad said the same, I'm glad you asked. He said, these past couple of years, he says, I've heard you say before around the office, the run faster, jump higher thing. I said, yeah. He goes, you do know that I know that you think you can run faster and jump higher than me. Right. And I looked at him, he goes, and you can. He says, but what you don't realize is I still have more stripes on my arm than you do. I'm still the boss. And he said, you need humility. Said the same thing as my dad. I was like, holy cow. And I asked for his forgiveness. I'm like,
Wow.
forgive me. I'm sorry that I haven't been serving you. And I got really emotional, and he got emotional, and it ended up putting us on a different path.
Yeah.
And it also was a lesson for me that, what I talked about as far as serving when I got here.
Yeah.
I remembered back then, and I thought, I cannot let that happen again. I'm going to have to be extremely humble and approach this in a way that I'm here to help serve these people and their families, all these people who work for me. And I need to work for them really, really hard to help them be successful personally and professionally. So I don't know, how do we get on that path?
Well, we had asked, you had other life dreams before being a CEO.
Oh, yeah.
But no, it was so good. And what I was thinking was, I think you had two ways to go about that, right? With your dad and the CEO was, you could have got angry or upset or didn't take their advice, but you went the other way. And what a different trajectory that obviously took you and the relationship. So.
I don't think my dad would have let me go the other way. That day, he was basically like, I'm tired of hearing you. 2 years you've been, he said, vomiting on me. He said, no more. I didn't and basically said, I didn't raise you to be that way. Yeah. I didn't raise you to be a complainer. I didn't raise you to be somebody who's full of yourself. Yeah. Suck it up. You're going to have to learn how to serve. So.
But it's easy to just kind of start going down a different way, right? And just kind of start making steps that you're like, oh, I guess I'm sure you didn't go out being like, oh, I'm not going to be humble. I'm not going to show love to this person. It's just you just kind of start inching your way that way. Then for someone to like call you out in a good way to see something better in you, I think is really, really
I think it's that concept that you've heard people say or use when they go, oh, he or she, they're reading their own press clippings. It's that concept. It's like people tell you how good you are, and you're like, yeah, I guess I am pretty smart. I'm pretty good at this thing. And then I think that you have to run into that proverbial brick wall at some point in your life if you don't course correct. And I think I was headed in that direction.
Yeah.
The brick wall was my dad basically stopping me and saying, son, listen, get your act together. And, it served me really well. I've told that story, funny enough, Nancy, a number of times to younger men and women here at this credit union and my last credit union who were getting a little bit ahead of themselves, where I'm like, hey, let me tell you a story. Before you crash and burn on your
Learn
own.
from my mistake, right?
Exactly. Let me tell you this story.
Do you think that they took it well, or?
I do. And, interestingly, it gets back to what you had asked about your, leading with your faith. Each one of those conversations had for me, I basically said, a part that I didn't say in here is I got the chance to tell that story and then talk about, really sitting down and talking with my dad, talking with Anita, praying about it and receiving a bit of guidance in terms of what direction I was going to head.
Right.
And again, even that just talking about, getting a chance to pray about it, you watch people and they're like, interesting. They might not say much,
Right.
Occasionally over the years, somebody has said, tell me more about that part. Which part? Well, the prayer part. Tell me about that part. Did you really do that?
Yeah. Now, when you kind of had to give up, I'm just going to say for points of your music career, were you sad? How did it feel to be put into because you probably had some big goals with that, or what is it like to have your life kind of shifted in maybe a way that you're not sure you're ready for or want?
Yeah, I would, most of the time people would probably say it was devastating. For me, it wasn't, because we had just had our oldest son. And, I was at home, I was in between shows, and I came home because Anita was due, and we had our son Trey, and I was at home with them for 2 weeks. And so with a newborn, and my wife, and then I 2 weeks later had to jump on a plane and fly out of the country for 6 weeks. And I remember I was sitting on the plane and in Miami, and I was getting ready to take off, going to be gone for 6 weeks, and it was that epiphany. I'm like, I'm out. And when I got back, you know, I basically laid the groundwork to sort of unravel, you know, whatever the contractual commitments I had to honor those things, and I was still singing. I ended up leading worship at a church and played in a band, and we traveled and stuff. So sort of side stuff.
Yeah.
But I never looked back, because it was I just knew that my calling was to be a husband and a father, and whatever else, work-wise, whatever happened. But I was like, I do know this: I need to be a really good husband, and I need to be a really good father. And so I don't think I ever looked at the music part and said, man, I'm devastated. I can't do that anymore. I got to do it for another 20 years, honestly, and primarily through church, through worship team. But yeah, I always joke and say, when I retire, maybe I'll go back.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's so cool. Well, one last question. I'm sure you have to make goals for a company and for yourself at a regular basis, and I feel like there's a lot of people who aren't very good at that. Like, how do I make a goal? How do I stick with it? Could you give us maybe some general tidbits for somebody?
How do I make a goal? Well, for me, I think it kind of starts with a vision, right? And I think that one of the things that has always served me well, certainly in my career, has been, you know, I've never been satisfied. Like, we just finished, Nancy, a phenomenal year here at the credit union. Like, financially speaking, we had a great year, and we had 131 people who got promotions this past year, and we grew, and we did all these things. But I have this restlessness. I'm like, man, it's fantastic, guys. We did a great job. High fives. Okay, tomorrow's a new day. We have to, and a part of how I'm wired is I always look out into the distance and say, what do we need to do as a company to ensure that, you know, for the 750 people here, that we're always working to be successful as an organization, so we can help those families and help them afford life and help our members afford life. And so I've always been gifted with the ability to sort of look out and have a pretty colorful vision. So for me, it starts with that vision, and then basically saying, you know, how can we get there, and what do we need to do? What steps do we need to take, or what plans do we need to put in place? And very, very importantly, you know, what people do we need to be to make this a reality? But I think that if it answers your question, I think the first step is just to have a vision, and you've got to be bold about that as well. Okay. You know, when you decided you wanted to do the podcast, you know, I'm sure you were like, you know, at one point you can't be timid. You have to just say,
right.
I got to jump off a cliff.
Right.
I'm going to do this podcast. You were like, Chris, I'm doing this podcast.
Yeah.
I don't know how I'm doing it, but I'm going to do this thing, and these are the resources that I need. You cast a strong vision with that, and then basically said, now I need to put a plan in place. How am I going to make this thing happen? You know, how can I get the equipment? Where can I do this? At the library, or wherever it is.
Yeah.
What type of people? What do I want the format to be? And most importantly, what do I want the reach to be? You know, what's the message, you know, that I want to try to convey to people? I don't know if that answered your question.
Are you ever afraid that you're going to fail?
Am I afraid that I'm going to fail? I'm never afraid that I'm going to fail. I'm always afraid about, I'm always concerned about failing others, right? So that's a part of casting a pretty bold vision. If you do that, and you inspire hearts and minds, and you convince people to go along with you, then it's a big burden that for somebody like me that I carry. That's the thing, is I'm I'm always concerned or afraid, if you will, about failing them, right? And so I always want to be diligent about, paying very close attention to what people need, the tools and resources to be successful, what kind of personal encouragement that they need. That's why I think it's so important also to know, I pay very close attention to people, their families, and do they have kids, and, are they, engaged, are they dating, are they, what's going on in their lives, so that I can sort of be, tune into that and make sure that I'm there to help support them.
But that fear, I'm just going to call it fear, doesn't stop you from going for a big goal, though.
No.
Okay.
No, I've messed up so many times, and I'm not worried about messing up. I don't want to mess up on behalf of other people, right?
Yeah.
So I've never been. I was always the kid growing up that was the first one to jump off the cliff into the lake or whatever, which is kind of goofy sometimes, but yeah, I'm not. I've never been that afraid of that.
So still set the vision high in order to keep growing.
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, I always love to end with, what is your favorite Bible verse or story?
The favorite story, that's a great question. Favorite story is just the resurrection story. I think that I've always been about redemption and, people, being, that's where the grace comes in, right? For me. Here at Canvas, it's always about, I don't think anybody here in the organization who knows me, certainly not leaders, somebody like your husband, Chris, I think that they all know that when I say that I want them to be bold and to, I want you to work hard and all those things, but I'll always back you up. I don't think any of them are afraid of making a mistake, if they're trying to do the right thing. And so I think, again, going back to my favorite story, I'm all about redemption, right? And giving people the opportunity to have another chance. I think people are inherently good people, and want to do good things. And they want to serve people, right? And so that's why I always go back to that story. I mean, I don't know if there's really no other story.
Yeah.
In the history of mankind, that is more about, very specifically, redemption.
That's so good. And what are you grateful for?
I'm grateful for my family.
Great.
Yeah. I have 4 kids and 2 son-in-laws, and soon to be a daughter-in-law, and 2 grandkids, and soon to be 3rd grandkid.
Oh.
So incredibly blessed, incredibly grateful for my family.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your time, and thank you for everyone who was watching or listening. I hope that this podcast has inspired you.